for Michael tonight, so you're going to have to put up with me. It was either that or John. I'm also going to be filling in for him the first Wednesday in October. So he's going to have a procedure done and he won't be able to. So I've discussed, I think the last class was on the different versions of the Bible. Before that was apologetics. Tonight, it's going to be apologetics. And in October, it will probably be another class on apologetics. These are notes that I have taken down and studied over the years. We had a class at MSOP on apologetics. When we think about apologetics, what does that word mean? A defense. Yeah. It's giving an apology. But it's not an apology that we think of. Comes from the Greek word apologia, which does mean to give a defense of what you believe. There were a group of individuals in the 2nd century that they're referred to as apologists. And what they were doing was they were writing to whoever Caesar was in office at the time, writing to him and the others, giving a defense of what Christianity truly believed in, what the worship was involved in as far as practicing the religion. Because there was a lot of things that the Jews, of course, but also the Romans especially, thought about the Christians that were not true. So they were known as apologists. And when we think about apologetics, I like to think of it in a different way. I like to think of it as Christian evidences. Christian evidences that are found not just in the scriptures, but through history, through archaeology, that prove what the Bible is teaching and has taught is in fact the truth. I was reading an article just the other day, and it was dealing with an individual who did not believe that Jesus even existed. And you would be surprised, there's plenty of people who do not. How would we answer that? What could we tell someone to show them proof that there was a man, Jesus, from Nazareth, who actually lived and died on a cross in Jerusalem? Now, you can't use the Bible. That's internal evidence. You've got to look at external, the writings of people down through the years. How would we answer that? He's one that wrote. Yes, that's exactly correct. You're cheating. But yeah, that's how you do it. German rationalism started to rise up in the 19th century. This was, to me, a form of humanism. We don't need God. You can rationalize anything and everything. But that they disputed whether the scriptures were true or not. They would try to find all kinds of evidence to show that the scriptures were not. And many of them, of course, did not believe in Jesus. And there's a lot of people even today that do not believe that Jesus of Nazareth existed. So Josephus, Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger also referred to Jesus. And we'll talk about them in a second. Who's heard of an individual called Tacitus? Okay. I used to even have one of his books called the Annals. And what he was is he was a historian, a Roman historian, and that book, the Annals, dealt with the Roman emperors. It is interesting because it takes you back to that period of time while he's writing about the emperors and the goings-on and of the Roman soldiers and things like that. He lived between AD 60 and AD 120. Well, if Jesus died around 33 AD, it wouldn't have been that long, about 30 years before this man was born. Tacitus hated Christians. He hated the religion of Christianity. He was a believer in the plurality of gods, like most of these were. They believed in idol worship, the worship of the Roman gods. They thoroughly believed in that. So here you have a religion that has taken people away from that. So he disapproved of it.
And the Roman gods are kind of from the Greek gods.
Yeah.
With a different name.
Just a different name. That's it. They stole Greek mythology, basically. They just gave them a new name. But the same gods.
Rome has a Parthenon.
Yeah.
The Greeks have a Pantheon, almost the same.
Right.
And that's where they house their gods.
Yeah. Yeah, and that building, the Pantheon, is still there. But that's where they housed all of their gods.
And if you've ever watched a soap opera, it is right from the Greek mythology of all of the goings on of this god and that god.
Well, you've just told on yourself. But I never thought of it that way.
I was sick at home when I was 14, and my mom was watching soap opera.
Folks, that's an example of an apology. He was giving a defense. But that's interesting. And that makes sense, actually. So he was basically known as the dean of Roman historians, and his hatred was such an extreme for Christianity. But that also gives a little bit more emphasis on what he had to say, what he had to teach. That makes his testimony, you could say, even stronger. Come on in. We don't bite. We're having a class on Christian evidences tonight. Now, what he did in writing about Nero, you remember that in Nero's time, the persecution upon the Christians really started. It wasn't worldwide as it would become, but it was pretty much just in Rome, that area. And you remember the fire that they had, which burnt a good portion of the city. Guess who got the blame? History tells us. Christians. They were the ones who got the blame. Well, Tacitus even came to the defense of the Christians that there's no way that they would be involved in something like that. Writing about that, he mentioned about the persecution of the Christians. He named their leader, and the leader was Christos, Christ. They called him Christos, and he wrote that he was executed at the hands of Pontius Pilate and the region of Tiberias. Well, that's what the Romans called Judea. They called it Tiberias, after one of their own. But Tacitus wrote that the Christians were innocent of the crimes that were actually brought against them. And this would have been toward the end of that first century and going into the second. Pliny the Younger, not as famous as Pliny the Elder, but he was fairly famous. What do we know this individual for? He was basically a Roman governor in Bithynia. Bithynia is pretty much the north middle part of what is modern-day Turkey. So he worked there. He was a Roman governor, and he had letters back and forth between the emperor and himself, and asking the emperor, how do I deal with Christians? And they were not really being unlawful. But at this period of time, there was a difference known by Rome between Judaism and Christianity. You remember when Christianity started, they didn't tell a difference. They thought Christianity was just a sect of Judaism. And when the Romans would come in and they would conquer a land like Judea, they would allow the Jews to continue to worship the way that they've always worshiped, just as long as they behaved themselves, which they had a hard time doing. But they would allow that to go on. But a religion that wasn't sanctioned, and Christianity wasn't sanctioned by Rome, they would be persecuted. And they were persecuted from around the middle part of that first century until the beginning of that third century. So a number of years. Sometimes the persecution would be very severe, sometimes it wouldn't be too difficult, so it went in that way. Any questions, comments?
He's one that you have a record of writing to the emperor.
Yeah.
And of how he's going to persecute.
Yep, that's the one. The emperor was Tiberius. So letters going back and forth. And he wrote about the early church because he had his spies watching the Christians. And he wrote to the emperor telling them how these Christians would gather early in the morning, first day of the week, I'm assuming, but early in the morning. Now remember, a lot of the people at this period of time were slaves. So they would have to gather early in the morning to worship, and then they would go work. But he talked about them different acts of worship. But one of the things that we have that he definitely wrote about was their singing. They would gather at an appointed time and sang hymns to Christ. And he talked about it would be men and women, old and young. So you would have men, women, elderly, to children, probably even babes. They would be there and they would sing songs to Christ. And he's writing it from his viewpoint, as Christ was a God. He's a Roman. Now again, this was an illegal sect, a religion, according to that period of time, so that's why they were spying against them. But he also mentions they were spreading. They were spreading into the cities, they were spreading into the villages, and they were spreading into the rural districts as well, which is exactly what the book of Acts, for example, teaches. You think about that first persecution in Jerusalem by Saul of Tarsus. Some people believe that this may have been the providence of God, basically giving them the boot to get out of Jerusalem and take the gospel with them. But they were just staying there in Jerusalem. So with that persecution that they did spread. Another individual, Lucian of Samosata, sounds like a place in Central Florida. But he lived between 125 and 190 A.D. He had held a government post in Egypt, and he knew of Christ. He described Christ as the originator of the cult of Christianity. That's how he phrased it. And that he was crucified in Palestine for originating this cult. So that's how they referred to Christianity. Now, again, 125 to 190, he probably came into his power of authority in Egypt, probably closer toward the end of that 2nd century, but they still knew about Christ. And they still knew about Christianity. They still knew about Christians. I assume, and probably rightly so, that there were Christians in Egypt. So, that's what he had to state. Mentioned Josephus in his writings around 93 A.D., writing in reference to Jesus, how Pilate condemned him to death, and how he appeared to live again to his followers on the 3rd day. So at this period of time, getting close to the end of that 1st century, Josephus knew about Jesus. He knew about Jesus in that story, as he would think of it, he was a Jew, of actually rising from that tomb on that 3rd day. And his disciples actually had saw this. That was the story at that period of time. Now, another thing to think about, if Christ had not existed, would his disciples have died for him? Someone that didn't exist? Or, if he did exist, but he did not rise from that tomb, he would have proved himself to be just an ordinary man. Do people generally die for a lie that they know that's a lie? Generally? No, we don't do that. But his apostles, as far as we know except John, all died. Probably a grisly death. Questions, comments, disagreements?
Josephus would be considered like a correspondent with the army with Titus. He would go into battle, he would with them and report.
Yeah.
Report what I was saying.
He did. He, very intelligent, high-class family. He started to fight against Rome at the beginning, but quickly gave up. He knew it was no way you could win this. And Titus, seeing that he was an educated man, allowed him to come up with him to watch Jerusalem fall. So he had a seat right there in front of it all to watch it take place. And you read any about his writings and about what was taking place in the city walls of Jerusalem, it's gruesome. It's horrendous. Horrible siege. Is there any evidence, external, of a Christian church existing, even to this day, going back into that 2nd, 3rd, or 4th centuries, something like that? You know of any? That's a long time. I'm going to take silence as a no. Well, you're in luck. According to an article that came out in Associated Press back in November of 2005, in an ancient building estimated to have been in existence in the 4th century, that's the 300s, they uncovered it, archaeologists. Yotam Tepper was the lead archaeologist of the dig. This was near the biblical site of Armageddon in the Valley of Galilee. On the floor of this building, they found a mosaic of 2 fish. Okay. What's the significance of 2 fish?
The apostles were fishermen.
Apostles were fishermen. 2 fishes and loaves. Yeah. Good answers. In that first century and the centuries that followed, understand that they were hiding from the Roman persecution. We understand this from how the book of Revelation was written and all these signs and these symbols. We have a difficult time understanding what those signs and symbols are. They would not have had a difficult time. But they had to write it this way. John had to write it this way. So information could get out to the Christians, and if, let's say, their enemies found it, they wouldn't know what to do with that. It would seem nothing to them. It's like those code breakers in World War II. So,
I think they even made it in catacombs down in the African Way.
we're going to get to that. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, they did. But these symbols of 2 fish were very common at this period of time. This would tell people where the church met. If Roman authorities saw this, they wouldn't know what to think of it. It probably wouldn't think anything about it. Most seem to believe that this comes from Jesus telling his disciples to be fishers of men. First of all, I thought was what Phyllis thought is about the loaves and the 2 fishes. Of course, this was Matthew 4:19. But they found another discovery in this building. It was an inscription on the floor, large church building, that it was stated to be dedicated to the God Jesus Christ as a memorial. What does that sound like? Do we not observe a memorial on the first day of every week? Lord's Supper. But this clearly shows that in the early 300s, people believed that Jesus had lived, which means they would have believed that he had died, crucified, at Golgotha, Jerusalem, by Pontius Pilate, but on the 3rd day, he rose from the dead, proving he was the Son of God. And of course, this memorial, remembrance, was to show that he deserved to be remembered. But it also shows that Christians in the 4th century had not given up those teachings that began in that 1st century, recorded in Acts chapter 2 in the beginning of the church. It was not lost. It was continuing to be spread throughout that known world. That Jesus was deity, and were even willing to die for him. And most of the Christians, they did die. Some did cave. Some would denounce Jesus as the Son of God, but most did not. I've often thought a power like Rome, who's used to conquering everybody in its wake and forcing people to do what they wanted or will kill you, and then you have this one group, mild, meek-mannered, but they're saying, go ahead, kill me. I think it terrified them. And it eventually led for that empire to be turned upside down.
Like they said that back, was it back? People would come in and
Turn the world upside down. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brother Rice reported too that when he went to China, in the ancient Chinese there, they found a church of Christ there that had been there for all these centuries.
Yeah.
And he reported about that. He saw that with his own eyes.
Yeah. I believe it. We don't know exactly what happened to all the apostles or the other New Testament prophets, the teachers like Timothy. I had heard somewhere or read somewhere that they thought Timothy went as far as to India. And it could be. We just don't know. But we know the gospel spread.
Wasn't Peter in that area?
In India?
Right in that area?
I don't know.
What I've read, yes.
Yeah, could be.
You know, the Magi came from the east,
Yeah, sure did.
so that would be possibly China.
Could be. Wise men. 3 of them.
Yeah.
Doesn't say that. And although they did come from afar, they weren't firemen.
Well, they had to study astrology, they said we saw it.
Yeah,
So they were keeping up with the
yeah.
constellations.
Very knowledgeable. Very knowledgeable.
Well, they had to know something about that star and what it meant,
Yeah.
to go look at whatever was at the bottom of that star.
Well, since you brought that up, as an aside, as someone would say, and this is not my fault if we don't cover everything, we'll get to it the next time. This will be Paul Brantley's fault. Who found out and wanted to ask the wise men, when you find out where this king of the Jews is going to be, come and tell me? Herod. Herod was evil. He was vicious. And according to the scriptures, and I believe Matthew's the only account that brings this out, Jesus, of course, escaped. They went into Egypt. But he decided just to cover the bases. What was he going to do? 2 years and younger, slaughter them all. So he sent men down there to slaughter them. And of course, people, especially Jews, would say, well, there's no way that he would do something like that. Really? I mean, the scriptures say that he does. That's enough for us. But here's an individual who killed his wife, killed his mother-in-law, had his 3 sons killed. Another relative, another relative drowned, had him drowned. Caesar Augustus, talking about Herod, said, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son. Being a Jew, he wouldn't eat the pig. The pig would be safe, but if it was a son, who knows? And he killed them all. Power hungry. There's some mental, technical terms for people like that, psychopath possibly, something like that. But also, I just read this today. A number of years ago, they found a makeshift burial in that part of the world, close to Bethlehem. And in it, they found a number of infants. They found their bones. And the bones that they found, they were able to determine the age of 2 years old and younger. Now, we can't pinpoint and say this is exactly what took place at that period of time, but I find it interesting. Okay. There's a church building in the ruins of Dura, Iraq. Was discovered back in AD 232. Excavating was done in the 1920s and the 1930s. In a house, they found a chapel made by adjoining 2 rooms, a platform and a baptistry in this house. Amongst the scenes on the wall, Christ walking on the water, the 2 Marys before the tomb, temptation of Adam and Eve, Now the catacombs of Rome. I was in Rome in 1980, in May. It was hot. And so we got to see the ruins and to walk around the old forum and be able to touch. The Senate building is still there. And being a history fan, I was in hog heaven. But the catacombs were closed. They were doing some kind of work. But you could walk by them, maybe 10 yards away, and you could feel this cold, air-conditioned air coming out. It was so cool in there. It was the catacombs. It was underground.
We was able to go down there.
Yeah, I would love to.
This hole, there was just that
Oh, yeah.
hole dug into the wall in the body.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the Christians that used them. I mean, a lot of the Romans buried their dead in there.
It did open up in some rooms, you could see where they could worship.
Well, that's the thing. They have found about 35 what they would call Christian catacombs they've discovered. The oldest date back to that first century and going into the middle of the second century. It has been thoroughly documented as in some of those places, as Brother Brantley stated, a place of worship and burial for those early Christians. Why would they meet there? Hide from the Romans. But they have found paintings on the walls of the catacombs that show images of Lazarus being raised from the dead, Noah escaping the flood, Daniel escaping the lion's den, and even Jonah escaping the whale. Some have surmised that this is basically a deliverance. These images emphasize deliverance, and possibly deliverance is found in the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you were a slave in Rome at this period of time and you were a Christian, you were looking for deliverance. He was your one and only hope. As one archaeologist mentioned, the early Christians who used them left a wholehearted testimony to a trust in Christ and his saving power. If we could only save some people from going to sleep, we'd be set. Wake him up. There's some more evidence that we're going to look at the accuracy of the New Testament. Acts. Acts is a history book of that first century church. A history book. Page after page about the history of the first century church, the people who lived in it, even the names of people. You think about all the cities and the villages that are named, even islands like Malta was named. Amazing. Luke, the human writer, inspired by God to do all this, and we understand it had to be inspired because no man could do this. Back in the day when you would get the Rand McNally a book for where you want to travel, there's mistakes. Not as much as these GPSs I've heard of, but mistakes. An example, if someone would turn to Acts chapter 17 for us and read verses 6 through 8 for us, because Luke speaks of the politarchs. These were the rulers of Thessalonica. Brother Hatcher mentioned them in class. Acts 17, verses 6 through 8.
And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, these that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things.
Rulers of the city. In the Greek, that's politarchs. Well, a problem arose with the critics of the Scriptures. And it always arises with the critics of the Scriptures. There's nothing that ever mentioned about this word politarch. Matter of fact, it's not even found in the Greek language. So they had nothing in the Greek literature. So Luke had to have made a mistake. But did he? No, of course he didn't. They have found over a period of time 17 inscriptions of that word, politarch. Five in Salonica, which is the modern day version of Thessalonica, which show the accuracy of Luke. They even found a Roman arch with that title, politarch. They were city officials. Thessalonica, like Ephesus, was a free city. We talked about this on Wednesday night. Free city was, you all have been doing so well, such good followers of Rome, we're going to let you govern yourself just as long as you do what we tell you. So they allowed certain cities to do this. Thessalonica was one of those cities. You remember that Paul stood in judgment in Corinth in Acts chapter 8, verses 12 through 16. It speaks of that. That was because of the Jews. Basically, once again, lying about him and what he was teaching. Judaism at this period of time was dead. It was a dead religion, even though they were still practicing it. And they referred to, in the American Standard Version, a deputy proconsul. This man was Gallio. He's the one that turned the table on the Jews. He freed Paul and basically gave a physical boot to the Jews. Now, they have found evidence that this individual actually did live. He was a proconsul in Corinth. They even found the judgment seat where he judged these matters. And they found that he was proconsul in Corinth around AD 51. Guess who was there in AD 51? The Apostle Paul. We've all heard the account of Sir William Ramsay. Very educated man, a great archaeologist. He was so good he became a knight. But he spent around 30 years as an archaeologist, and most of that time in Asia Minor, Turkey. Now what he went to do was he set out to prove Luke was wrong. He didn't think much of Luke as being a historian. And matter of fact, he also set out to try and prove the writings of Paul, that they were wrong as well. But after 30 years of study concerning Luke as an historian, and going to these places where Paul had been, and Luke being a companion of his so much of that time, this is what he wrote about Luke. He said, Luke is an historian of first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, but should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. And later he would become a Christian denomination. But before then, I don't think he believed in much of anything. Luke wrote about Augustus. He mentioned Tiberius. He mentioned Claudius. He mentioned the Herods, Felix, Festus. Roman governors in Judea, and of course, a number of other individuals as well. No mistakes. All of these individuals lived. Gallio, for example, was in Corinth. He was a judge at that period of time. Luke mentions 32 countries. Think about that. 54 cities, 9 Mediterranean islands, 95 persons mentioned in the book of Acts, and not one mistake. Now, how can you not think that God inspired him to write these things down? Because man alone could have no hope of doing that. No mistakes. And after all these years, they found none. That tells me that the book we call the Bible is the Word of God. And that Christianity is the only way to live. Because Jesus is the Christ. He is the Son of God.
He wrote all of the conversations down, too.
Yes, he did.
Like word for word.
Yeah. That's right. I think we have time for one more. You remember a fellow called Sergius Paulus? Acts 13, verse 7. In Crete, Paul and Barnabas. What's interesting here is Sergius Paulus was referred to by Luke as the deputy proconsul of Cyprus. Deputy proconsul. The critics claim that Luke should have used another title. Luke was wrong. For Cyprus at this time was an imperial province, and the title should have been consular legate, not a deputy proconsul. Problem with that, they found these Cyprian coins, and evidence showed that Cyprus at this period of time actually was a senatorial province and was governed by a proconsul, just as Luke wrote. So the critics, they got it wrong again. You remember for so many years, no one ever believed in the Hittite nation. That was just another example of the Bible getting it wrong until they started discovering their cities, their capital city in Turkey. Oops. But they never take it back. But the Hittite nation was a very strong and a very powerful nation for a long time, going as far as Judea even. Questions? Comments? Well, I hear someone coming. So I guess we'll just close it right there. We'll pick up about another month and a half.